Since the MCU first began, all the way back in 2008, Marvel have experimented with many different approaches to the classic heroic archetype. But regardless of whether they've been rich or poor, smart or goofy, naive or wise, guilty or noble, the same central heroic ideal lay at the heart of these characters each and every time: the ideals of moral conviction and self-improvement. That's why it shocked me to see, when watching Marvel's latest project, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, that they intentionally sought to deconstruct this age-old concept of heroism, the heroism that Marvel has built its kingdom upon, and replace it with something quite different, and in my opinion, quite destructive. Let's dive in. Now, I know we all already know what a hero is, but for the purposes of this video, I think it could be quite useful to make it crystal clear what we're talking about here. Colloquially, a hero is someone who's noble, selfless, and courageous, someone whose actions are admirable, someone with qualities we'd like to imitate in our own lives. And you may think that fictional heroes are simply characters who embody these characteristics, and that's true, but it's also a bit more complex than that. Fictional heroes, especially Marvel's heroes, don't always act heroically. In fact, more often than not, they're people with very fundamental character flaws, experiencing serious moral dilemmas, and they usually make some pretty grave mistakes along the way. So clearly, their heroism isn't just derived from their heroic acts, otherwise every film would just be one heroic act after another from start to finish. For us to derive any meaning from the story whatsoever, we have to watch the protagonist strive towards that heroic ideal, what the author Joseph Campbell described as the hero's journey. We have to watch them acknowledge their personal flaws and struggle to overcome them, re-evaluating themselves and their morals in order to discover the noble path, and defeating their personal demons in order to find the courage and the ability to do what's right. So really, when you distill it down to its essential ingredients, heroism is the moral conviction that the hero manifests, and the personal growth that they undergo in order to act on these convictions. And that's the reason why we, the audience, find so much satisfaction in watching these stories play out over and over again. Yes, there's the action and the spectacle and the CGI battles, but there's also a relatable human story of someone facing their fears, overcoming their flaws, and unlocking their heroic potential. This is what Campbell refers to as the pedagogical function of heroic mythology. Essentially, it inspires us and provides us with a roadmap of personal growth, a broadly applicable framework of how to approach the problems we face in our own lives. And that's why I personally take so much interest in the superhero films that make up so much of our modern popular culture. I mean, you could just dismiss them as mindless escapism, like some unnamed people like to do, but for me, these stories are our cultural mythology, and the heroic narratives that they portray are actually really important, both as an affirmation of, and a commentary on, our current heroic ideals. So what does this have to do with The Falcon and the Winter Soldier? Well, when watching this series, it's really obvious from the get-go that the show is trying to make a meta-commentary about this exact subject matter, taking a critical eye to the heroism that Marvel has been relying upon for all these years. We start seeing more and more vague references to the idea of rejecting previously held standards of heroism and the social norms that these standards are implied to uphold. The very notion of a hero with superpowers is repeatedly tied to the concept of supremacy. The symbolism of Captain America's shield is tied to the concept of hegemony, and there are multiple references to the fact that the superhero regime needs to be upturned and refashioned in some way. As Sam says himself,
"We need new heroes. One suited for the times we're in."
Now, don't get me wrong, there's no issue with the show taking a self-critical or postmodern approach to the superhero genre. In fact, that's exactly what Marvel's been doing for the last decade. The genre is rich with implications about society's ideals and cultural identity, especially in the case of heroes like Captain America, who has national symbolism sewn into the very fabric of the character himself. Using these heroes to analyse and criticise social norms or value systems, or even to reassess our understanding of human nature and morality, is, in my view, something that these characters are primed to do. That being said, when it's done poorly, this approach can be very destructive. Tearing down one ideal is only useful if you propose something constructive to take its place. And Falcon and the Winter Soldier does not do this. In fact, it does the opposite. Rather than using the heroic archetype to deconstruct social norms, value systems, and conventional morality, like Marvel has done plenty of times in the past, the Falcon and the Winter Soldier chooses to deconstruct the heroic archetype itself, replacing the central principles of moral conviction and self-improvement with moral relativism and hollow protest. This message is best illustrated through the dynamic between Sam and John Walker, with Walker acting as an avatar for the old form of heroism that the show seeks to detract, and Sam standing as an example of the new form of heroism that the show is attempting to establish. Walker strives towards a heroic ideal, and he acts on his convictions. He takes a moral absolutist stance on the terrorist group the Flag Smashers, and he takes a straightforward approach in opposing them. Yes, he makes some horrible mistakes along the way, but by the end of the story, he's grown as a person, he's learned from his mistakes, and he uses his newfound abilities for good. And if you ask me, this is a pretty conventional heroic arc. Yet the show consistently tries to frame Walker in a negative light, using musical cues, camera angles, and the rare inclusion of blood to make you feel like what Walker is doing is unprecedented and villainous, despite the fact that it's nothing we haven't seen our other heroes do thousands of times before. Contrast this with the altogether different approach taken by Sam, which the show clearly attempts to glorify. He acts under the assumption that the situation is morally ambiguous, choosing to negotiate with the terrorists and taking a pacifist approach. But the issue that the show quickly runs into is the fact that the situation the writers have constructed isn't actually very morally ambiguous at all. The GRC, the big bad international agency of the show, are never actually shown to be doing anything unreasonable. In fact, they seem to be very earnestly attempting to deal with the complicated realities of the human population suddenly doubling overnight after the blip.
GRC, they're doing the best they can to get things up and running smoothly post-blip.
Reactivating citizenship, social security, healthcare, basically just managing resources for the refugees who were displaced by the return.
The Flag Smashers, on the other hand, are shown to be a group who have radical motivations, completely unrealistic goals, and are willing to commit all manner of violent crimes in order to achieve their objectives, including literally burning people alive.
There were still people in there.
This is the only language these people understand.
The fact that our hero is confused about where his allegiances should lie, and is willing to even entertain the possibility of redeeming these terrorists, would be questionable enough on its own, but the writers take this idea to extremes that I truly would never have predicted. They force Sam to explicitly sympathise with the terrorists' cause, stating in a conversation with Carly, the leader of the Flag Smashers,
I'm not your enemy. I agree with your fight.
And when it comes to the final confrontation in the series finale, Sam refuses to even lay a finger on Carly while she ruthlessly attacks him, and it's left to the other characters in the story to actually physically oppose and ultimately defeat the terrorists. And the reason behind Sam's bizarre ethical inconsistencies throughout this entire show is crystal clear when you pay close attention to some of the dialogue that the writers sprinkle in, explaining Sam's perspective. He repeatedly invokes the concept of moral relativism, emphasising how your assessment of what's morally justified depends entirely on your subjective point of view.
Yeah. Violent revolutionaries aren't usually good for anyone's cause.
Usually say about the people with the resources. Trust me, every time something gets better for one group, it gets worse for another. That's because Carly is the only one fighting for them. She's not wrong. To them, at least Carly's doing something.
Now this is obviously true in a descriptive sense, but when you start applying this in a normative sense, this approach to morality completely breaks down. Taken to its logical conclusion, you either embrace moral nihilism, where ethical claims are so subjective that they're rendered completely meaningless, or you find a separate set of principles to guide your judgment on these issues. For example, a postmodern perspective would be to use power dynamics as this guiding principle, disregarding the irrelevant question of morality and instead judging every situation by the relative power held by the people involved. This seems to be exactly what the writers have forced Sam to do, siding with what he perceives to be the powerless group against what he perceives to be the powerful group, regardless of the moral quality of their behaviour. This is perfectly illustrated in the climactic speech that Sam gives in the final episode of the show, when he scolds the senators for referring to the Flag Smashers as terrorists.
You did your part in dealing with those terrorists, now we'll do ours.
You have to stop calling them terrorists.
What else would we call them?
Your peacekeeping troops carrying weapons are forcing millions of people into settlements around the world, right? What do you think those people are going to call you?
As you can see, the question of whether either side's actions are justified is irrelevant to Sam, because in his mind all of their behaviour is morally subjective, and therefore morally equivalent. The only thing that concerns him is that these are the people in power, and thus they are acting as the oppressors. And this is what I mean when I say Falcon and the Winter Soldier is trying to deconstruct and redefine heroism. Discovering the moral convictions that guide the protagonist on their heroic path was once at the core of Marvel's heroism. But here, that principle isn't just missing, it's actively subverted by the narrative. So that's the first ingredient of heroism thrown completely out the window. So what about the second ingredient? Self-improvement. Well, consider the significance of this being the climactic scene of the series in the first place. Not a struggle of good over evil, not a hero courageously facing their fears, not a self-sacrifice, or any of the many other ways that you could demonstrate the hero's personal growth. Instead, it's a nauseating televised lecture during which the hero provides no solutions for the grievances he airs, admitting that he doesn't understand the complexity of the situation, yet demanding in vague terms that others must do better.
Look, I get it, but you have no idea how complicated this situation is.
You know what? You're right. And that's a good thing. The only power I have is that I believe we can do better. You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up. Because if you don't, the next Carly will. And you don't want to see 2.0.
This is Sam's heroic moment, the fruition of his supposedly heroic journey. But does it feel heroic? It certainly doesn't to me. In fact, it feels embarrassing. Watching Sam Wilson, one of my favourite MCU heroes, stand in front of a crowd monologuing about problems he doesn't understand and doesn't have solutions for. Not a hero changing to improve the world in which he lives, but a hero demanding that others must change. Once again, this isn't just the removal of a heroic principle, it's a direct inversion of it, replacing internal personal growth with hollow external protest. So here's my question to Marvel, and my question to you, the viewer. Is this what heroism is now? Instead of working hard to establish and maintain a cogent set of moral convictions, you embrace unbounded moral relativism? And instead of addressing your personal shortcomings and striving to improve yourself, you simply demand, in completely abstract terms, that everyone else should do better? I don't know what I'd call this new heroism, but to me it isn't heroic at all. It's a complete reversal of heroism framed in a heroic light. It isn't inspiring, it isn't compelling, it isn't moral, and it certainly doesn't give you a constructive lesson of how to deal with problems in your own life. And that's a real shame, because these are all things that Marvel's heroes have effortlessly achieved in the past. But anyway, that's just my thoughts on the matter. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you disagree with me, but either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.